In the earliest years of the nation, when the word America still felt more like an idea than a place, the land itself seemed to move more slowly than the people who lived upon it. Mornings arrived quietly, not with urgency, but with a gentle light that spread across wide fields and narrow dirt roads. The air carried the smell of soil, wood smoke, and distant rivers, and the day began not with announcements or headlines, but with simple routines repeated so often that they no longer felt like choices. Roosters crowed, doors opened, boots touched the ground, and work began without much reflection on why it needed to be done. Small towns were scattered across the landscape like unremarkable dots on an enormous map. Many of them did not even have official names yet, only descriptions: the crossing near the river, the settlement by the mill, or the place beyond the old oak. Houses were built close to the earth, often from the same materials that surrounded them: wood from nearby forests, stone from shallow quarries, clay from riverbanks. There was little sense of architecture as art. Buildings existed to serve a function, and once that function was met, no one thought much about how they looked. Life followed the rhythm of daylight. The concept of time was loose and flexible, defined more by the position of the sun than by clocks or schedules. People spoke of morning, afternoon, and evening, but rarely of exact hours. To wake before sunrise was normal, not impressive. To fall asleep shortly after dark was expected, not a sign of laziness. The land itself dictated behavior, and most people obeyed without resistance. In rural areas, the landscape was vast and often empty. Fields stretched far beyond what the eye could easily measure, interrupted only by fences, barns, and occasional clusters of trees. Rivers moved slowly, carrying with them the quiet sense that something important was happening somewhere else, far downstream. Forests stood thick and silent, not yet symbols of national identity or environmental concern, but simply obstacles that needed to be cut through or sources of fuel for the winter. Ordinary people rarely spoke about history. It was not something they felt themselves to be part of. History belonged to books, to distant capitals, to names printed in newspapers that arrived weeks late or not at all. What most people experienced was not historical change, but personal repetition. The same chores, the same meals, the same conversations with neighbors who had known each other for years and expected nothing new from one another. A farmer, for example, might wake every day with the same list already written in his mind: feed the animals, check the fences, walk the fields, repair whatever had broken overnight. The work was endless and rarely dramatic. There were no speeches, no applause, no clear sense of achievement. At the end of the day, the land looked mostly the same as it had in the morning, and the farmer felt older by one more quiet day. In town, life was only slightly more varied. The general store opened early and closed when the light faded. Inside, shelves were stocked with goods that arrived irregularly and unpredictably: flour, salt, cloth, tools, and sometimes items no one had specifically asked for. The storekeeper knew every customer by name, not because he was friendly, but because there were so few people to remember. Conversations were short and practical. News traveled slowly, and when it did arrive, it often felt disconnected from immediate reality. Someone might mention that a new law had been passed, or that a conflict was unfolding in another state, or that a political figure had made a speech somewhere far away. These statements were received politely, but without urgency. After a few moments, the conversation would return to crops, weather, or the price of supplies. Large events felt distant, almost fictional, like stories told about another country, rather than developments that could affect daily life. The roads connecting these towns were narrow and unreliable. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and often unnecessary. Many people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. The idea of going somewhere else existed mostly in imagination. The land beyond one's immediate surroundings felt abstract, defined more by rumors and maps than by personal experience. When people did travel, it was usually for practical reasons: to trade, to visit family,
to attend a legal proceeding or to seek medical help. These journeys were described not in terms of adventure, but in terms of difficulty. Mud, broken wheels, unpredictable weather, and long periods of waiting were considered normal parts of movement. Arrival was less important than endurance. Despite the vastness of the land, life felt confined, not physically, but socially and mentally. Most people interacted with the same small group of individuals every day. They shared similar beliefs, similar fears, similar expectations. Differences existed, but there was little language to describe them. Diversity, as a concept, had not yet become a subject of reflection. People simply lived among those who were already there and assumed that this was how the world was structured. The sense of restlessness that later generations would associate with America existed only faintly at this stage. There were no slogans about opportunity, no widespread belief in reinvention. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance of limitations. Children grew up into the same roles as their parents. A blacksmith's son learned metalwork. A farmer's daughter learned domestic routines. The future looked very much like the past, and this similarity provided comfort rather than frustration. Education was basic and inconsistent. Some towns had small schools, often one-room buildings where a single teacher instructed children of all ages. Lessons focused on reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. There was no clear vision of education as a path to transformation. It was merely a tool for basic competence, not a gateway to a different life. Even literacy, when present, did not necessarily lead to intellectual exploration. Books were rare and usually practical: religious texts, farming manuals, legal documents. Fiction existed, but it was not widespread. Imagination was not yet a cultural priority. Survival and routine took precedence over storytelling. Religion played a quiet but steady role in daily life. Churches were often the only large communal spaces in a town. Services were regular, predictable, and emotionally restrained. The sermons emphasized discipline, patience, and moral order, rather than excitement or innovation. Faith was not about transformation, but endurance. It provided a structure for understanding suffering, not a promise of escape from it. Social gatherings were limited and repetitive. Weddings, funerals, seasonal festivals, and religious holidays marked the passing of time, but rarely altered its direction. People dressed differently, ate slightly better food, and stayed up a little later, but the underlying structure of life remained unchanged. Celebration was temporary, routine was permanent. There was also a noticeable absence of urgency in how people thought about the nation itself. The idea of America as a unified identity had not yet fully settled into everyday consciousness. Loyalty was local, not national. People identified more strongly with their town, their church, their family, and their immediate environment than with any abstract political entity. When the government was mentioned, it was usually in relation to taxes, land ownership, or legal disputes. It existed as a distant authority, not an emotional symbol. The state did not yet feel like a personal presence. It was something that sent documents, not something that shaped identity. Even conflict, when it occurred, was often experienced indirectly. News of wars or political tensions arrived through letters and delayed reports. There were no images, no recordings, no real sense of immediacy. A battle described in words felt more like a story being retold from another world. As a result, most people experienced history not as a sequence of dramatic moments, but as a background noise that never fully entered their personal space. They lived inside time, but not inside history. Their concerns were immediate and tangible: food, weather, health, family, and survival through the next season. The land itself seemed indifferent to human ambition. Fields grew or failed according to weather, not political decisions. Rivers flooded without regard for laws. Winters arrived on schedule, regardless of economic plans or social dreams. Nature provided a constant reminder that human systems were temporary and fragile. This created a form of quiet humility. People did not expect the world to improve rapidly. They did not believe in progress as an automatic process. Instead, they focused on maintaining what already existed. Stability was more valuable than change. Predictability was more comforting than possibility. Children grew up watching adults repeat the same motions every day. They learned not through instruction, but through observation. Life was not explained, it was demonstrated. The future did not need to be described because it looked exactly like the present. In this way, early American life was defined less by ambition than by continuity. The famous restlessness of later generations had not yet fully emerged. Instead, there was a deep, quiet stillness beneath the surface of daily activity. People worked, rested, prayed, and waited, not for transformation, but for tomorrow to resemble yesterday. History, meanwhile, was unfolding elsewhere.
In the years when the nation was still learning how to describe itself, government did not arrive as a dramatic force. It entered quietly through documents, signatures, seals, and carefully written words that most people rarely read in full. There were no grand ceremonies in everyday life, no constant reminders that a new political system existed. Instead, governance appeared gradually, folded into routine through papers that accumulated in drawers, offices, and small wooden cabinets behind desks in town halls. For ordinary people, the idea of the state felt abstract. It was not something seen or heard directly, but something implied by forms, taxes, and regulations that arrived without much explanation. A farmer might know that a new rule existed, but not where it came from or who had written it. A shopkeeper might pay a fee to someone representing a distant authority, but never meet anyone who truly embodied that authority. Government existed mostly as an invisible presence, expressed through paperwork rather than personal interaction. The Constitution, for many, was more a symbol than a practical guide. Its language was formal, distant, and difficult to connect to daily concerns. People heard about rights and freedoms, but what they experienced were procedures, registration, documentation, permissions, and obligations. The grand promises of political philosophy filtered down into small administrative acts that shaped everyday behavior in subtle ways. Town meetings became one of the few visible expressions of governance. They were held in simple buildings, often churches, schools, or shared community halls. Attendance was uneven. Some came out of curiosity, others out of obligation, many out of habit. The meetings themselves were rarely dramatic. They followed predictable patterns. Someone read an agenda, discussions unfolded slowly, decisions were postponed, and records were carefully written down. These gatherings were not spaces of revolutionary thought. They were spaces of cautious negotiation. People spoke about road repairs, property boundaries, local taxes, and the hiring of officials. The tone was practical, restrained, and sometimes indifferent. Political participation felt less like shaping the future and more like maintaining order. The language of governance was heavily formal. Even in small towns, official documents were written in elaborate, almost ceremonial style. Ordinary requests were transformed into long sentences filled with legal phrasing. This created a distance between citizens and the systems meant to serve them. People complied with rules not because they fully understood them, but because the rules were written in a way that discouraged questioning. Over time, paperwork became a central feature of American life. Births, deaths, marriages, land ownership, business operations all required documentation. These records were stored carefully, not because people expected to revisit them often, but because their absence could cause future problems. Paper became a form of memory, replacing personal recollection with official confirmation. The act of signing a document took on special importance. A signature represented agreement, responsibility, and submission to an external system. Many people signed papers they did not fully read, trusting that the system was functioning correctly. Others signed out of necessity, knowing that refusal would bring complications rather than solutions.
Local administrators emerged as quiet figures of authority. Clerks, record keepers, tax collectors, and minor officials occupied modest offices and handled large volumes of information. They were not powerful in appearance, but their control over documents gave them influence. A misplaced form could delay a process for months. A missing stamp could invalidate a transaction entirely. These officials rarely inspired strong emotions. They were not admired or feared. They were simply there, performing tasks that seemed dull but essential. Their work consisted of organizing, categorizing, and archiving human activity into systems that could be managed from a distance. Promises were often embedded within this paperwork. Political leaders spoke of opportunity, fairness, representation, and progress. These promises were written into laws, charters, and declarations. Yet for most people, the connection between these ideals and their lived experience remained unclear. The promises existed on paper. Daily life remained unchanged. The gap between language and reality created a peculiar form of quiet tension. Citizens were told they were free, but also found themselves increasingly regulated. They were promised participation, but mostly experienced administration. They were described as sovereign, but spent most of their time complying with rules they had not personally created. This tension was rarely discussed openly. There was no widespread sense of dissatisfaction, only a vague awareness that governance felt distant and impersonal. People accepted bureaucracy as a necessary inconvenience, much like weather or illness. It was something to be managed, not something to be transformed. Legal disputes became one of the main ways people encountered the state directly. Courts handled disagreements over land, debts, contracts, and personal conduct. These proceedings were slow, formal, and heavily procedural. The outcome often mattered less than the process itself, which reinforced the idea that authority resided in documents rather than individuals. Lawyers and judges emerged as specialized interpreters of language. They translated everyday conflicts into legal terms and returned them as official decisions. Their authority came not from personal charisma, but from mastery of texts. The law became a world of its own, operating according to rules that felt separate from ordinary logic. As population increased and communities expanded, administration became more complex. New departments were created, new roles defined, new procedures introduced. Each layer of organization required additional paperwork, additional staff, and additional regulations. Governance grew not through dramatic reform, but through gradual accumulation. The physical presence of government remained modest. There were no massive buildings or visible monuments in most towns. Instead, there were small offices with wooden desks, shelves filled with ledgers, and filing systems that no one fully understood. The state existed not as architecture, but as storage. Communication between different levels of authority was slow and uncertain. Letters took weeks to arrive, decisions were delayed, instructions were misunderstood. This created a system that moved at a pace similar to everyday life, slow, careful, and resistant to rapid change. In this environment, political ambition was limited. Few people imagined themselves as future leaders or reformers. Participation in governance was seen as a responsibility, not a path to influence. Holding office meant dealing with complaints, forms, and minor conflicts rather than shaping grand visions. Even elections felt restrained. Campaigns were small-scale, focused on local reputation rather than ideology. Candidates spoke about reliability, experience, and trustworthiness. Voters chose familiar figures not because they promised transformation, but because they represented stability. The concept of representation remained abstract. People voted, but rarely felt represented. The connection between individual voices and collective decisions was difficult to perceive. Democracy existed as a principle, but bureaucracy defined the experience. Over time, this created a culture of quiet compliance. Citizens learned how to navigate systems without questioning their structure. They filled out forms, paid fees, attended meetings, and accepted decisions. The act of participation became routine, stripped of emotional intensity. Children grew up observing these processes without fully understanding them. They learned that adulthood involved paperwork, that authority spoke through documents, and that important decisions happened in rooms they would probably never enter. Governance became part of the background of life, like infrastructure or climate. The promises written into founding texts remained largely symbolic. Freedom was discussed, but rarely felt as an active force. Equality was proclaimed, but not experienced as a daily reality. Rights existed, but were mediated through institutions that filtered and delayed their expression. This did not produce open resistance. Instead, it produced patience. People waited for systems to respond, for documents to be processed, for decisions to be finalized. Waiting became a political experience, even if it was not recognized as such. The age of paper and promises transformed human interaction. Relationships between citizens and authority were no longer personal, but procedural. Trust was placed in systems rather than individuals. Responsibility was distributed across offices rather than concentrated in leaders. As bureaucracy expanded, it created a new kind of social order, one based on classification, regulation, and documentation. Identity itself became tied to records, names on lists, numbers in registers, signatures on contracts. To exist officially meant to exist on paper. In this way, governance reshaped everyday life without dramatic
Movement in early America was not defined by speed, but by effort. Distance was measured less in miles than in days, and sometimes in weeks. To travel from one place to another required not only intention, but endurance, preparation, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. The land was wide, uneven, and often resistant to human plans, and every journey became a negotiation between the traveler and the terrain. Most roads were not really roads at all. They were dirt paths shaped by repeated use rather than design. Wagon wheels carved shallow grooves into the earth, and over time these grooves became routes. In dry weather, they produced clouds of dust that lingered in the air long after a vehicle had passed. In rain, they turned into long stretches of mud that trapped wheels, slowed animals, and made even short trips exhausting. Travel by wagon was physically demanding and emotionally dull. The movement was constant but slow, the landscape changing so gradually that it felt almost static. Trees passed one by one, fences appeared and disappeared, and hills unfolded at a pace that gave travelers too much time to think and too little to distract themselves. There were no landmarks meant to impress. Everything looked similar enough that progress was difficult to perceive. Inside the wagon, people sat in silence or spoke about practical matters. Food supplies, weather conditions, and the health of the animals dominated conversation. There was little sense of adventure. Journeys were undertaken because they were necessary, not because they were desired. Arrival was valued not as an achievement, but as the end of discomfort. Rivers offered an alternative to roads, but not a faster one. Boats moved slowly, carried by currents that could not be controlled. Travel upstream required physical labor, poles, ropes, and long hours of effort. Downstream movement was easier but unpredictable. Floods, shallow water, and changing channels created constant uncertainty. River travel encouraged waiting. Boats were delayed by weather, by water levels, and by traffic. Travelers often spent days anchored near banks, doing nothing but watching the water move past. The river became a symbol of time itself, always moving, never hurried, indifferent to human schedules. Canals were built to impose order on this natural unpredictability. They were carefully engineered, lined with stone, and reinforced with locks that regulated movement. In theory, canals represented progress. In practice, they remained slow and restrictive. Boats moved in narrow channels, unable to pass one another easily, forced to wait their turn at every lock. The canal system required cooperation, patience, and constant maintenance. Travelers stood on deck as workers adjusted gates, filled chambers with water, and guided vessels through confined spaces. The process felt mechanical, repetitive, and strangely ritualistic. Movement was permitted, but only within strict boundaries. Railroads would later transform transportation, but in their early form, they were not the symbols of speed they would become. Trains moved cautiously, stopping frequently, constrained by fragile tracks and limited technology. Breakdowns were common, delays were expected, accidents were accepted as part of the system. Even rail travel required waiting. Tickets were purchased in advance, schedules were approximate, and departures were often postponed. Stations became spaces of quiet anticipation. People sat on wooden benches, surrounded by luggage, listening for announcements that might or might not arrive on time. The experience of travel shaped how people thought about communication. Messages moved at the same pace as people. Letters were carried by riders, wagons, or boats. Delivery times were unpredictable. A letter sent might arrive weeks later or not at all. This created a culture of delayed response. Conversations unfolded slowly across distances. News traveled by word of mouth, filtered through multiple retellings. By the time information reached its destination, it had often lost urgency or accuracy. Events that felt immediate to those involved became distant stories by the time they were heard elsewhere. Waiting became a fundamental part of life. People waited for news, for visitors, for supplies, for instructions, for answers. Waiting was not considered a problem to be solved. It was accepted as a condition of existence. Time passed not in units of minutes, but in long stretches of inactivity, punctuated by brief moments of movement. This rhythm shaped emotional expectations. People did not expect immediate satisfaction. They did not demand instant replies. They were accustomed to uncertainty and delay. Planning involved broad estimates rather than precise schedules. Life was organized around possibility rather than predictability. Isolation was a natural consequence of slow transportation. Many communities were effectively self-contained. Contact with the outside world was limited and irregular. People developed strong local identities, not because they rejected others, but because they rarely encountered anyone beyond their immediate surroundings. A town might go weeks without receiving new information. The arrival of a traveler or a shipment became an event, not because it brought excitement, but because it interrupted the monotony. The unfamiliar was noticeable precisely because it was rare. This isolation influenced how people thought about the nation. America existed as a concept, but not as a lived experience. Most individuals interacted only with a small fragment of it. The rest remained imagined, constructed from maps, rumors, and incomplete descriptions. Even when national events occurred, elections, wars, economic changes, they reached communities slowly. The emotional impact was delayed. By the time news arrived, it had lost immediacy. Reactions were measured, muted, and often disconnected from the original event. Travel also shaped social relationships. Visiting relatives or friends required long journeys, so visits were infrequent but extended. When people arrived, they stayed for weeks or months. Short visits were impractical. This created relationships that alternated between long absence and prolonged presence. These patterns encouraged patience, but also resignation. People learned to accept distance as permanent. They did not expect constant connection. Separation was normal. Reunions were anticipated, but not urgently pursued. The physical effort of movement influenced the imagination. The world beyond one's immediate area felt distant and abstract. Cities were described as crowded and noisy, but few had seen them. Coastal regions were discussed as centers of trade, but remained conceptual for inland communities. Travel narratives existed, but they emphasized difficulty rather than discovery. Stories focused on broken wheels, lost routes, harsh weather, and physical exhaustion. The land was not romanticized. It was something to be endured. Children grew up observing this slow movement and internalized it as natural. They learned that change took time, that distance created separation, and that waiting was unavoidable. The idea of rapid transformation did not exist. Progress was measured in small improvements, not dramatic leaps. The pace of transportation also influenced economic behavior. Markets were local. Goods were produced and consumed within limited regions. Trade across long distances was expensive and unreliable. This reinforced self-sufficiency and reduced dependence on external systems. Even cultural exchange was slow. Music, literature, and customs spread gradually. Trends did not arrive simultaneously. A style popular in one area might take years to appear elsewhere, if it appeared at all. This created multiple versions of American life existing at the same time. Different regions lived in different temporal realities, shaped by their access to movement and communication. There was no unified national rhythm, only overlapping local ones. The experience of waiting became so embedded in daily life that it rarely attracted attention. People waited without complaint because there was no alternative. Time was not something to be managed aggressively. It was something to be inhabited. In this environment, patience was not a virtue, it was a necessity. Frustration had no practical use. Anger could not make roads smoother or rivers flow faster. Acceptance became the dominant emotional response to distance and delay. The land itself taught this lesson repeatedly. Mountains resisted passage, rivers redirected routes, weather altered plans. Human intention remained secondary to natural conditions. Movement occurred, but only within limits set by the environment. Over time, these limits shaped collective behavior. Americans learned to think slowly, to plan cautiously, and to accept that most outcomes would be delayed. Expectations were adjusted downward. Urgency was replaced by endurance. When faster systems eventually emerged, they would feel revolutionary precisely because of this long history of waiting. But in the early period, speed was not yet a value. Slowness was normal. Waiting was not a problem. It was the default state of existence.
The work that sustained early American life rarely produced visible results. It did not announce itself, and it did not invite attention. It unfolded quietly in fields, workshops, offices, and small storefronts, where effort blended into routine and routine disappeared into time. There were no crowds to witness it, no ceremonies to commemorate it, and no clear moment when one could say that something important had been completed. Farmers were among the first to experience this kind of labor. Their days began before sunrise and ended after sunset, shaped by weather patterns that could not be controlled and seasons that repeated without variation. The land required constant attention, plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, repairing tools, tending animals. None of these tasks felt final. Each action simply prepared the way for the next one. A farmer might spend an entire day clearing stones from a field, only to find new ones exposed after the next rain. Another might harvest a crop that barely covered the cost of seed and labor. There was no applause for success and no public acknowledgement of failure. The land responded silently, offering yields or withholding them without explanation. The work was physically demanding but emotionally restrained. There was little space for reflection. Exhaustion replaced ambition. Most farmers did not think of themselves as builders of a nation. They thought of themselves as caretakers of land that required endless attention. Their contribution to larger systems, markets, food supply, economic stability, was invisible in daily experience. Factory workers encountered a different environment, but a similar absence of recognition. Inside early industrial buildings, tasks were repetitive and narrowly defined.
One person performed the same motion hundreds of times a day, producing parts that would be assembled elsewhere into objects they might never see. The factory did not offer narrative. There was no beginning, middle, or end to the work. Machines dictated rhythm, and workers adapted their bodies to mechanical patterns. Time was measured in shifts rather than seasons. Fatigue replaced reflection. At the end of the day, the worker left with no clear sense of what had been accomplished beyond physical depletion. Clerks worked in quieter spaces, but their labor was equally invisible. They copied documents, recorded transactions, filed records, and managed correspondence. Their labor consisted of organizing information that rarely had personal meaning. Numbers replaced names, forms replaced conversations. Accuracy mattered, but creativity did not. A clerk might spend years maintaining the same ledger, watching pages fill with data that represented other people's lives, debts, purchases, property, legal disputes. Yet the clerk remained separate from these stories, functioning as a mediator between individuals and institutions. The work required attention, but offered no emotional engagement. Shopkeepers occupied a more visible position, but recognition remained limited. They opened their doors each morning, arranged goods on shelves, greeted familiar customers, and repeated the same exchanges. The store became a space of continuity rather than change. People came for supplies, not for connection. The shopkeeper learned to predict demand. Flour, salt, cloth, tools, these items moved slowly and predictably. New products appeared occasionally, but rarely altered the structure of daily life. The shop existed to maintain stability, not to introduce novelty. Conversations in the store were practical and restrained. Prices, shortages, weather, and local events dominated speech. There was little emotional expression. Transactions replaced relationships. The shopkeeper's role was to facilitate exchange, not to interpret it. Across these different occupations, a shared pattern emerged. Labor was constant, but meaning was distant. People worked because work was necessary, not because it offered identity or purpose. The idea of self-fulfillment through labor had not yet developed. Work was not expected to be meaningful. It was expected to be done. There were no narratives of success for most workers. Wealth was concentrated elsewhere, and social mobility was limited. A farmer's child often became a farmer. A factory worker's family remained tied to industrial labor. Clerks advanced slowly, if at all. Shopkeepers inherited businesses or passed them down without transformation. The absence of recognition created a culture of quiet endurance. People did not expect to be noticed. They did not seek praise. They measured success not in achievement, but in survival. To maintain stability, to avoid crisis, to provide basic necessities, these were considered sufficient goals. This endurance shaped emotional expression. Pride was rare and modest. Complaints were private and restrained. Suffering was normalized. Hardship was not framed as injustice, but as a natural condition of existence. Work was integrated into identity without being celebrated. A person was known by occupation, farmer, worker, clerk, merchant. But these labels described function, not status. They indicated what one did, not who one was. Even when productivity increased, recognition did not follow. Higher yields, faster production, more efficient systems benefited institutions rather than individuals. Workers saw little change in their daily routines. The scale of output grew, but the structure of experience remained the same. This created a disconnect between contribution and perception. People built infrastructure, produced goods, maintained systems, but did not feel like builders. Their labor disappeared into collective outcomes that no single person could claim. The nation developed, but individuals did not feel developed. Progress occurred at the level of systems, not at the level of lived experience. Roads expanded, markets grew, industries flourished, but daily routines remained unchanged. This invisibility of labor influenced how people thought about value. Worth was not associated with effort, but with position. Those who managed, owned, or represented institutions received recognition. Those who performed essential tasks remained anonymous. The emotional distance between workers and outcomes reduced expectations. People did not imagine alternative futures. They did not seek transformation through work. They accepted repetition as the defining feature of life. Children observed this pattern and internalized it. They learned that adulthood meant labor without acknowledgement. They saw their parents return home exhausted, without stories of achievement or celebration. Work was not discussed as experience, but as obligation. Education did not challenge this structure. Schools prepared students for functional roles, not creative ones. Skills were taught for employment, not for self-expression. The purpose of learning was integration into systems, not personal development. Religion reinforced endurance. Sermons emphasized patience, discipline, and humility. Work was described as duty rather than fulfillment. Reward was promised elsewhere, not in daily experience. Even leisure reflected this structure. Free time was limited and unremarkable. People rested to recover, not to explore. Entertainment was modest and repetitive. There was no strong separation between work and life. Work defined the rhythm of existence. The absence of applause created a stable emotional environment. Expectations remained low. Disappointment was avoided by not anticipating recognition. People found meaning in continuity rather than success. This stability had a cost. It limited imagination. It discouraged ambition. It reduced the possibility of dissatisfaction becoming collective. Without recognition, there was no platform for demand. Without narrative, there was no framework for change. Yet this quiet labor sustained everything. Food supply, industrial growth, administrative systems, commercial networks, all depended on work performed without visibility. The nation rested on efforts that were never acknowledged and rarely remembered. History would later describe these workers as the foundation of development, but in their own time, they were not aware of any historical role. They did not experience themselves as participants in a national project. They experienced themselves as individuals performing necessary tasks. Work without applause created a world where contribution was invisible, endurance was normal, and recognition was not necessary. It shaped a society that valued stability over transformation and routine over aspiration. The nation emerged not through celebrated achievements, but through accumulated effort that left no trace in personal memory. The builders of everyday life remained unnamed, their labor absorbed into systems that continued without ever calling attention to those who made them possible.
The growth of American cities did not arrive as a single dramatic transformation. It unfolded gradually through small changes that accumulated over years and decades. There was no clear moment when a town became a city, no sudden shift in identity or atmosphere. Instead, urban life emerged through layers of adjustment, more people, more buildings, more noise, more rules, until the original shape of the place became difficult to remember. Most cities began as modest settlements. They were built around practical needs: a river crossing, a port, a railway station, a factory, or a market. At first, these places felt temporary, like extended villages rather than permanent centers. Houses were spaced apart, streets were narrow and irregular, and daily life remained slow and familiar. People recognized one another. Names carried meaning. The boundaries of the community were easy to imagine. As populations increased, these boundaries became less clear. New residents arrived quietly, often without ceremony or acknowledgement. They built homes near existing ones, sometimes too close, sometimes on land that had not been intended for housing at all. Fields turned into neighborhoods, paths became streets, empty spaces filled with structures that served immediate needs rather than long-term plans. The expansion was uneven. Some areas developed rapidly, while others remained unchanged for years. A new factory might attract hundreds of workers, leading to a sudden increase in housing, shops, and services. Meanwhile, nearby districts continued at the same pace, unaware that their environment was slowly shifting. Growth did not move outward in smooth circles. It appeared in scattered clusters, shaped by economic opportunities rather than design. Housing reflected this imbalance. In many growing cities, buildings were constructed quickly and cheaply. Function mattered more than comfort. Rooms were small, ventilation was poor, and privacy was limited. Families lived close to one another, sometimes separated only by thin walls and shared staircases. Noise traveled easily. Conversations, arguments, and footsteps blended into a constant background presence. Overcrowding became common, but it was rarely described as a crisis. It was simply accepted as a condition of urban life. People adjusted their expectations. Personal space became less important than proximity to work. Comfort was secondary to convenience. The city offered access, not ease. Immigration played a central role in this transformation. New arrivals came from different regions and countries, bringing languages, customs, and habits that did not always align with existing patterns. They settled where they could find work, often in industrial districts or near transportation hubs. These neighborhoods became dense, layered with cultural differences that were visible but not always understood. Interaction between groups was limited. People lived close to one another physically, but remained socially separate. Communities formed along lines of language, religion, and occupation. Streets became divided, not by official boundaries, but by unspoken agreements about where certain people belonged. This separation did not result in open conflict most of the time. Instead, it produced a quiet form of coexistence. People shared space without sharing experience. They passed one another on sidewalks, in markets, and in public transport, but rarely exchanged more than necessary words. The city became a collection of parallel lives, moving through the same environment without intersecting. Noise increased steadily. Factories operated throughout the day, producing mechanical sounds that replaced natural ones. Carts, wagons, and later motor vehicles filled the streets with movement. Voices overlapped. Construction never fully stopped. Silence became rare, limited to early mornings or temporary interruptions in activity. This noise was not interpreted as disturbance at first. It was seen as evidence of productivity. Sound indicated work, movement, and economic life. Quiet, by contrast, suggested stagnation. Over time, people adapted. They learned to speak louder, to ignore constant stimulation, and to accept sensory overload as part of existence. Pollution followed a similar pattern. Smoke from factories darkened the air. Waste accumulated in streets and waterways. The smell of fuel, chemicals, and refuse became familiar. Environmental conditions deteriorated gradually, not dramatically enough to provoke immediate concern. People noticed discomfort, but rarely connected it to broader systems. Coughing, fatigue, and irritation were treated as individual problems rather than collective ones. The city's physical impact on the body was normalized. Health became a private issue, not a public responsibility. As infrastructure expanded, so did administrative systems. Streets were numbered, buildings were regulated, addresses replaced descriptions. People became easier to locate, classify, and manage. The city required organization to function, and this organization introduced new forms of control. Public services developed unevenly. Some districts received paved roads, lighting, and sanitation. Others remained neglected, lacking basic facilities. Inequality became spatial. It could be seen in architecture, in street conditions, and in access to resources. Yet this inequality did not always feel intentional. It emerged from layers of decisions made over time, none of which seemed decisive on their own. A road was built here, not there. A school was funded in one area, postponed in another.
These small choices accumulated into visible patterns of advantage and neglect. The transformation of small towns into cities altered social rhythms. Time became more structured. Work schedules replaced seasonal cycles. Shops opened and closed at fixed hours. Transportation followed timetables. The natural flow of life was replaced by mechanical regularity. People adjusted gradually. They learned to navigate crowds, to wait in lines, to share public spaces with strangers. Familiarity gave way to anonymity. It became normal not to recognize the people around you. The city introduced a new form of social distance, even in physical proximity. This anonymity affected behavior. Individuals felt less observed, less accountable to personal reputation. Interactions became transactional rather than relational. People spoke to others because they needed something, not because they shared history. In small towns, identity was reinforced through memory. In cities, identity became flexible. People could change jobs, neighborhoods, and social circles without explanation. Reinvention was possible, but rarely intentional. It occurred through necessity rather than ambition. Economic life intensified. Markets expanded. Goods circulated more quickly. Money became central to daily decisions. Survival depended less on land and more on wages. Employment replaced ownership as the primary source of stability. This shift created new forms of vulnerability. Job loss meant immediate insecurity. Housing depended on income. Community support weakened. The city offered opportunity, but also uncertainty. Stability was no longer guaranteed by tradition or location. Despite these changes, the emotional tone of urban growth remained restrained. There were no collective celebrations of development. There was no shared sense of arrival. People experienced growth as inconvenience rather than achievement. Traffic increased, living costs rose, space diminished. These effects were felt more clearly than abstract benefits like economic expansion or technological progress. The city demanded adaptation without offering clear rewards. Cultural life expanded quietly. Theaters, libraries, newspapers, and public institutions appeared, but they did not dominate daily routines. Most people remained focused on work and survival. Culture existed on the margins of experience, accessed occasionally, but not central to identity. The city did not erase older patterns completely. Rural habits persisted in urban settings. People maintained traditional customs, diets, and beliefs. Change was layered, not replacing one system with another, but combining them in unstable ways. This produced a sense of temporal confusion. Old values existed within new environments. Agricultural rhythms coexisted with industrial schedules. Religious practices continued alongside emerging secular institutions. The city contained multiple historical periods at once. As urban life stabilized, its limitations became more visible. Overcrowding produced stress, noise reduced concentration, pollution affected health, anonymity weakened community bonds. These issues were recognized individually, but rarely addressed collectively. The city was not experienced as a project, but as a condition. People did not feel they were shaping it. They felt they were living inside something that was already in motion. Growth happened around them, not through them. Even when cities became symbols of national progress, residents did not internalize this narrative. They experienced inconvenience, fatigue.
For most people, war did not arrive as an event. It arrived as information. It came folded inside newspapers, written in letters, spoken quietly in offices, or announced through administrative changes that altered daily routines without fully explaining why. The experience of war at home was not shaped by gunfire or marching armies, but by waiting, paperwork, and a gradual sense that something distant was unfolding somewhere beyond immediate perception. The first sign was usually language. Words like mobilization, conflict, enlistment, and rationing began to appear in public spaces.
They were printed on posters, repeated in official statements, and discussed in conversations that rarely included details. People learned to recognize these words without fully understanding their implications. They indicated a change in atmosphere rather than a change in experience. Newspapers became the primary interface between civilians and war. They arrived daily or weekly, depending on location, and carried reports that felt both important and abstract. Headlines mentioned battles, territories, and casualties, but these were presented as distant facts rather than lived realities. Numbers replaced faces. Locations were described without texture. The emotional content of events was filtered through formal language. Readers scanned articles quickly, not because they were uninterested, but because the information was difficult to process. The scale of war exceeded personal imagination. A single person could not meaningfully interpret the movement of thousands of troops or the outcome of distant operations. News became a background presence, something to be acknowledged and then set aside. Letters provided a more personal connection, but they were limited by distance and censorship. Soldiers wrote about conditions, weather, and routines. They avoided detailed descriptions of danger. Their tone was restrained, practical, and often reassuring. They spoke of missing home, of waiting, of small inconveniences. Violence appeared indirectly, hinted at rather than described. Families read these letters repeatedly, searching for meaning in ordinary phrases. A sentence about cold weather might suggest hardship. A delay in response might suggest danger. Communication became an exercise in interpretation rather than information. What was not written mattered more than what was. Waiting defined the domestic experience of war. People waited for news, for letters, for official notices, for changes in policy. Time slowed. Days passed without clear developments. Anticipation replaced action. The future felt suspended, uncertain but not urgent. This waiting was structured by administrative procedures. Forms had to be filled out, registrations were required, records were updated. The state expanded its presence through documentation rather than direct interaction. People encountered war not through soldiers, but through clerks and offices. Rationing introduced war into daily consumption. Certain goods became scarce. Sugar, fuel, fabric, and later other items were regulated. People received coupons or limits. Shopping changed subtly. Shelves looked different. Portions were smaller. Choices were restricted. These changes were framed as contributions to a collective effort, but they were experienced individually. Each person adjusted their habits quietly. There were no ceremonies for reduced consumption. There was only adaptation. People learned new recipes, reused materials, and accepted inconvenience as temporary. The language of sacrifice circulated widely, but its emotional impact remained limited. Sacrifice did not feel heroic. It felt administrative. It meant filling out forms, waiting in lines, and making small adjustments that accumulated into noticeable changes over time. Workplaces adopted as well. Some industries expanded, others slowed. Employment patterns shifted. New roles appeared, often labeled as essential. These changes were explained through policies rather than narratives. People accepted new schedules, responsibilities, and restrictions without fully understanding the broader context. Public spaces reflected these transformations. Posters encouraged efficiency, caution, and compliance. They used simple language and restrained imagery. The goal was not to inspire passion, but to maintain order. War was presented as a condition to be managed, not an experience to be dramatized. Schools incorporated war into curriculum through announcements and adjustments. Students learned about geography, current events, and civic duty, but the tone remained educational rather than emotional. War was something to be studied, not something to be felt. Even mourning was distant. Casualty lists appeared in newspapers, but names were often unfamiliar. Communities recognized loss abstractly. Individual families experienced grief privately, without public rituals or collective acknowledgement. Death occurred quietly, at a distance, mediated through official notifications. The absence of direct experience created a peculiar emotional gap. People knew war was serious, but they did not feel it continuously. There were moments of concern, followed by long periods of normal activity. Daily life continued with minimal interruption. The extraordinary existed alongside the ordinary, without merging with it. Entertainment persisted. Radio programs, films, and social events continued, sometimes incorporating references to war, sometimes ignoring it entirely. Distraction was not discouraged, it was necessary. Constant awareness would have been unsustainable. This coexistence produced a layered reality. War existed as information, as policy, as background noise. It did not dominate perception. It remained peripheral, present, but not central. The administrative nature of wartime life reinforced emotional distance. People interacted with institutions more than with events. They encountered regulations, schedules, and procedures. War became a system rather than a story. Military service, when it occurred, involved paperwork. Training schedules were standardized. Communication followed official channels. The personal experience of soldiers was absorbed into institutional processes. Those who remained at home experienced war through absence. Someone left. A place at the table remained empty. Work responsibilities shifted. These changes were subtle, integrated into routine rather than marked as exceptional. Over time, war became normalized. It lost its initial intensity. It became part of the environment, like weather or economic conditions. People adapted emotionally by reducing expectations and focusing on immediate tasks. Political discourse existed, but it remained restrained. Debates occurred, but they rarely altered daily behavior. Elections proceeded. Laws were passed. Life continued. Even major events, victories, defeats, or treaties arrived as announcements rather than experiences. They were read, discussed briefly, and then absorbed into routine. Celebration, when it occurred, was short-lived. Relief replaced excitement. The end of war did not feel dramatic either. It was marked by policy changes, demobilization, and the gradual return of goods and people. There were no clear emotional transitions. The atmosphere shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. People resumed previous habits without reflection. Rationing ended, news coverage changed topics, letters decreased. Administrative procedures remained, repurposed for peacetime. War left traces in infrastructure, economy, and memory, but not in daily sensation. It had shaped systems more than emotions. It had reorganized institutions rather than transformed individual consciousness. This distant experience created a paradox. War was described as defining the nation, yet most citizens encountered it only indirectly. It was a collective event without collective feeling. The absence of direct engagement altered how history was remembered. Narratives emphasized battles, leaders, and strategies, but these did not align with lived experience. For those at home, war had been a sequence of adjustments, not a series of dramatic moments. Memory focused on waiting rather than action, on letters rather than weapons, on shortages rather than victories. The emotional content of war was fragmented, dispersed across small changes that never formed a coherent story. This fragmentation reduced the possibility of trauma, but also of understanding. People knew war had happened, but they could not easily describe what it meant. It existed as a concept, not as a memory. Children grew up aware of war without having felt it. They inherited narratives without experience. War became something to be studied, not something to be felt. The distance between event and perception created a peculiar emotional gap. People knew war was serious, but they did not feel it continuously. There were moments of concern, followed by long periods of normal activity. Daily life continued with minimal interruption. The extraordinary existed alongside the ordinary, without merging with it.
Entertainment persisted. Radio programs, films, and social events continued, sometimes incorporating references to war, sometimes ignoring it entirely. Distraction was not discouraged, it was necessary. Constant.
For most citizens, politics did not feel like a continuous story. It felt more like an interruption. Every few years, attention was briefly directed toward campaigns, speeches, and voting days, and then just as quickly it faded back into silence. The long periods between elections were not filled with political debate or civic reflection. They were filled with ordinary routines that rarely included any reference to government at all. Elections arrived on the calendar like seasonal events, similar to harvest time or annual festivals. People knew they were coming, but they did not organize their lives around them. Political cycles existed, but they did not define daily experience. Most of the time, citizens were not thinking about laws, policies, or representatives. They were thinking about work, family, health, and the small practical concerns that occupied immediate attention. Campaigns introduced temporary noise into this quiet environment. Posters appeared on walls and fences, newspapers printed speeches and promises. Candidates traveled through towns, shaking hands and repeating similar phrases in slightly different forms. For a short time, political language became more visible, but it did not replace the dominant language of everyday life. People listened politely, but rarely with deep emotional investment. Campaign messages felt abstract, disconnected from concrete experience. Candidates spoke about the future, about reform, about national direction, but for most citizens, the future looked very similar to the present, and reform felt distant and unclear. Voting itself was a simple act. People arrived at polling stations, signed their names, marked their choices, and returned to their routines. The process was calm, procedural, and unremarkable. There were no crowds, no dramatic confrontations, no sense of historical importance. Voting was treated as a duty rather than an event. Many people voted out of habit rather than conviction. They supported familiar names, established parties, or candidates recommended by friends and family. Political identity was inherited more often than chosen. Opinions were shaped by local culture, not by detailed analysis of policy. After the election, attention disappeared again. The results were announced, briefly discussed, and then absorbed into the background of life. New leaders took office, but their presence was not felt directly. Government remained distant, expressed through institutions rather than personalities. For most citizens, politics existed as a layer of reality that operated above daily life, not within it. Decisions were made elsewhere, by people they did not know, using processes they did not observe. The outcomes appeared in the form of regulations, taxes, or administrative changes, but rarely as emotional experiences. This distance created a calm form of political disengagement. People did not feel excluded, they felt unaffected. The state was not perceived as an active force shaping identity. It was perceived as a system that maintained order, collected information, and occasionally introduced new rules. News media reinforced this emotional distance. Political reporting used formal language, statistics, and institutional terminology. Stories focused on procedures, negotiations, and official statements. There was little emphasis on how decisions affected individual lives in concrete terms. As a result, political information was consumed passively. People read headlines, listened to summaries, and then moved on. They rarely discussed politics in depth. Conversations returned quickly to personal matters. Politics remained something that happened in the background, not something that demanded sustained attention. The long silence between elections was filled with this quiet disengagement. People lived inside systems they did not question and accepted outcomes they did not fully understand. Political awareness existed, but it was shallow and intermittent. This did not mean people were indifferent, it meant they were practical. They had learned that most political changes did not alter the structure of daily life.
Whether one party or another held power, routines continued. Work schedules remained. Prices fluctuated slightly. Institutions functioned. Over time, this produced a stable emotional pattern. Citizens expected little from politics and were rarely disappointed. They did not look to government for personal meaning or direction. They saw it as a mechanism for managing large-scale systems, not for shaping individual experience. Political ideals, democracy, freedom, representation, existed as abstract concepts. They were taught in schools, printed in documents, and referenced in speeches, but they were not actively felt in daily life. They remained symbolic, not experiential. This gap between principle and perception shaped civic behavior. People complied with rules, paid taxes, and followed procedures without strong emotional response. Participation was minimal but consistent. Resistance was rare, not because people were satisfied, but because they did not expect alternative outcomes. The structure of political time reinforced this pattern. Campaigns created brief moments of attention, followed by long periods of inactivity. There was no continuous narrative to sustain interest. Politics appeared and disappeared from consciousness in predictable cycles. Children grew up observing this rhythm. They learned that adults talked about politics occasionally, usually during election seasons, and then stopped. They absorbed the idea that politics was something distant, formal, and not deeply connected to personal life. Education reinforced this perception. Civics lessons explained systems and institutions, but rarely encouraged emotional engagement. Students learned how government worked, not why it should matter to them. Political knowledge remained technical rather than personal. Even political conflict felt restrained. Debates occurred, but they were usually polite and limited. Strong ideological divisions were rare in everyday conversation. Differences existed, but they were not central to social identity. This restraint created a form of political stability. Without strong emotional investment, there was little motivation for radical change. Systems persisted not because they were admired, but because they were accepted. The long silence between elections was not a sign of apathy, it was a sign of normalization. Politics had become part of the background structure of life, like infrastructure or climate. It was always present, but rarely noticed. When major political events occurred, constitutional changes, national crises, significant reforms, they briefly disrupted this silence. Attention increased, emotions intensified, and people discussed politics more actively. But these moments were temporary. The system quickly returned to its usual quiet state. This pattern shaped historical memory. People remembered elections, scandals, and major decisions as isolated moments, not as continuous processes. The periods between them were forgotten, even though they represented most of lived experience. History books later emphasized political turning points, but for those who lived through them, these moments were surrounded by long stretches of ordinary life. The dramatic narrative of politics did not match the emotional reality of citizens. The emotional distance between people and politics created a peculiar form of democracy. Participation existed, but engagement was limited. Rights were recognized, but not actively explored. Representation was accepted, but not deeply felt. People lived as political subjects without political consciousness. They were governed, but not involved. They were citizens, but not in any emotional sense. The silence between elections allowed systems to operate without scrutiny. Decisions accumulated quietly. Policies shaped institutions gradually. Changes occurred, but they were not experienced as political. Instead, they were experienced as practical adjustments, new forms, new procedures, new regulations. The political origin of these changes was often forgotten. They became part of the environment, not part of debate. This distance created a calm form of political life. There was no urgency, no collective excitement, no shared anxiety. Politics was stable because it was emotionally distant. The nation functioned not through continuous civic energy, but through administrative continuity. Government did not require passion to operate. It required compliance, routine, and minimal participation. In this way, democracy became quiet. It did not announce itself daily. It did not demand attention. It existed as a structure rather than a story. The long silence between elections was not empty. It was filled with ordinary life continuing under political systems that most people rarely thought about. It was the space where citizens lived not as voters, not as activists, not as participants, but simply as individuals going about their routines while politics remained, patiently and invisibly, in the background.
The arrival of new technologies in early America was rarely dramatic. They did not knock on doors announcing themselves, nor did they appear as sudden transformations of everyday life. Instead, they entered quietly, gradually, and almost imperceptibly, like a slow tide that reshaped the landscape without warning. People adapted to their presence not because they were eager or informed, but because circumstance demanded it. Electricity, telephones, radio, and automobiles became part of life before most households had fully understood their significance. Electricity arrived first as a curiosity. A few homes, usually in wealthier neighborhoods, displayed flickering lights powered by small generators. It was more a novelty than a utility. Candles still burned in most rooms, lamps were filled with oil, and daily schedules remained tied to sunlight rather than circuits. Yet in some corners, the quiet hum of electrical wires began to insinuate itself into consciousness. People noticed the faint crackle of light bulbs, the slight warmth of a heater, and the occasional spark that accompanied experimentation. The adoption of electricity was uneven. Town centers often gained access before rural areas. Factories used it to power machinery, while homes remained reliant on older systems. In workshops, electricity accelerated production, but in kitchens and living rooms, candles and stoves persisted. This uneven introduction meant that the very concept of electrified living coexisted with older, slower routines for decades. Families navigated hybrid schedules, part modern, part traditional. The telephone arrived in much the same quiet fashion. Early exchanges required long cords and cumbersome apparatuses. The machines themselves were large, complex, and unfamiliar. At first, only businesses and affluent households adopted them. Calls were rare and brief. People learned to communicate through the device cautiously, aware that conversations could be overheard or misrouted. Telephones reshaped social interaction slowly. Messages that once required travel or letter writing could now be transmitted in moments, but most people did not yet perceive the practical advantages. Calls were considered remarkable events rather than ordinary acts. Families spoke of who could receive a call, who was allowed to use the line, and how privacy could be maintained. In time, the novelty faded, and the telephone became mundane, integrated into life quietly, with no ceremony marking its acceptance. Radio followed a similar pattern, initially confined to certain homes, shops, and public spaces. Early broadcasts were sporadic, often experimental and difficult to access. Families gathered around a single speaker, listening with quiet curiosity. Programs included music, news, and occasional lectures, but the sound was more a presence than a tool. It entered life gradually, influencing habits without explicit instruction. Children learned to anticipate broadcasts. Adults adjusted routines to accommodate the faint crackle of voices coming through the ether. Radio changed timekeeping subtly. People began to structure evenings around programs. Meal schedules, leisure, and work shifted imperceptibly to align with broadcasts. News became immediate rather than delayed, but still filtered through the formal and impersonal tone of announcers.
The information was shared widely, but the emotional effect remained restrained, consistent with a culture that measured change slowly and cautiously. Automobiles arrived quietly too, though their physical presence was more visible. Early cars were rare, noisy, and temperamental. They disturbed familiar streets with unfamiliar speed and odors. Pedestrians, horses, and wagons had to adjust, learning new patterns of caution. Automobiles did not revolutionize daily life immediately. They required infrastructure, fuel, mechanics, and licenses that appeared gradually over decades. For most families, the car was aspirational, not essential. A household might own a single vehicle, shared among several family members. Journeys were planned carefully, considering mechanical reliability, distance, and weather. Roads remained poor outside town centers, limiting the practical use of automobiles. Yet even occasional exposure to this technology introduced new rhythms into life. Trips became faster, errands could cover greater distances, and leisure activities expanded beyond immediate neighborhoods. The adoption of new technologies was cumulative. Electricity enabled radios. Radios created demand for electrical outlets. Automobiles encouraged the spread of gasoline and paved roads. None of this occurred in dramatic leaps. Each step was small, often unnoticed in isolation. Families adapted incrementally, learning by doing, negotiating the limitations and benefits quietly, without the urgency or fanfare that historians might imagine. These technologies altered domestic life subtly. Lighting extended hours of activity after sunset, changing patterns of work and leisure. Telephones and radio connected households to distant communities, reducing isolation but introducing new obligations to respond. Automobiles allowed movement beyond the immediate environment, expanding social networks gradually and quietly. Habits were altered not consciously, but by necessity. Meal preparation, work routines, and social schedules adapted to accommodate light, sound, and movement. The day no longer began and ended strictly with sunrise and sunset. Instead, the rhythms of technology guided behavior alongside nature. Evening gatherings included radios rather than solely conversation or domestic tasks. Errands were planned around fuel availability and road conditions. Education also adapted. Schools began teaching basic electrical knowledge, emphasizing safety and practical use. Telephone etiquette became part of instruction. Children learned to anticipate technological presence as part of ordinary life rather than extraordinary novelty. Knowledge was transmitted slowly, integrated into routines rather than highlighted as a sudden change. Economic life transformed incrementally as well. Factories mechanized operations powered by electricity. Transportation networks expanded with gasoline and tire technology. Retail and communication systems leveraged telephones and radios to coordinate activities. Yet workers, clerks, and consumers experienced change in small adjustments rather than as dramatic acceleration. Schedules shifted, practices adapted, but the broader social landscape remained recognizable. Technology arrived without permission in another sense. People did not request it, they received it. City planners, business owners, and utility companies introduced electrical lines, telephone poles, and roads according to efficiency, profit, and demand. Households and individuals were required to accommodate these developments. Adaptation was not optional. The presence of wires, machines, and vehicles gradually became part of what life required, not what life celebrated. This silent imposition created new forms of social negotiation. Families discussed which room could receive electricity first, who could use the telephone line, and when radios should be turned on. Communities negotiated traffic patterns and street usage as automobiles became common. The introduction of technology was as much social as mechanical, reshaping relationships quietly over time. Acceptance was gradual, not enthusiastic. New tools were sometimes resisted, ignored, or repurposed to suit older habits. Early electrical appliances were used sparingly. Telephones were monopolized by one household member. Radios were listened to in short bursts. Automobiles were parked for days, used only when necessary. This slow integration allowed life to remain orderly while the new technologies established themselves. Over decades, these inventions subtly transformed expectations. Children grew up assuming light would be available at night, that voices could traverse wires instantly, that music and news could arrive unbidden in their homes, that mobility extended beyond walking or horse travel. Habits, once rooted in limitation, adjusted naturally to accommodate possibility. Yet even with these changes, the cultural effect remained restrained. Technology shaped behavior and perception, but it did not dictate emotions. Enthusiasm was muted, awe was selective, and disruption was incremental. People absorbed inventions rather than celebrated them, integrating them quietly into daily life with little fanfare. The slow accumulation of these technologies produced a society that seemed familiar, even as it changed. Streets, homes, workplaces, and leisure activities evolved without producing a single moment of transformation. The effect was pervasive.
Life in early America was shaped not only by work and routine, but by the subtle rhythms of the economy. Unlike grand narratives of financial triumph or collapse, most people experienced economic change as a gradual adjustment of mood, expectation, and behavior. Markets rose and fell, prices shifted, wages varied, and debt accumulated quietly. These changes were rarely dramatic in immediate perception. Instead, they affected daily decisions, household routines, and personal anxieties. The economy existed as a background condition, like the weather, present, influential, and subtly felt in every moment. People noticed prices first. Flour, sugar, meat, and other staples fluctuated slowly in local markets. Some days a loaf of bread cost slightly more. Some weeks a sack of flour could double in price. Farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers adjusted cautiously, calculating carefully how far wages would stretch. Price changes were discussed quietly in homes, shops, and taverns, always measured in practical terms rather than ideological or dramatic framing. Wages were similarly variable, though less visible than prices. Many workers received irregular payment, sometimes in cash, sometimes in goods. Artisans, clerks, factory hands, and farm laborers adapted their expectations to the rhythms of employers and the wider market. A paycheck might arrive on time or be delayed, adjusted upward or downward with little explanation. Over time, people learned to live with uncertainty, building routines around unreliable income streams. Savings became a daily strategy rather than a long-term investment. Families set aside small amounts of money when possible, purchasing modest stores of food, fuel, or clothing to buffer against periods of scarcity. Savings were not glamorous or celebrated. They were a quiet shield against the unpredictable nature of markets. People rarely viewed themselves as investing in the future. They were simply creating a cushion against tomorrow's uncertainty. Debt was a constant companion. Small loans, credit extended by local shopkeepers, or informal borrowing between neighbors was common. People accepted debt as part of life rather than a moral failing. Repayment schedules were negotiated carefully, and obligations were often reshaped quietly over months or years. Default was frowned upon socially, but rarely met with legal enforcement except in extreme cases. Debt was practical, relational, and emotionally restrained. Economic fluctuations became visible in the household in subtle ways. Meal composition shifted with the cost of ingredients. A stew might be watered down, meat substituted with beans, sugar rationed.
Clothing was patched rather than replaced, schooling might be delayed, leisure curtailed, and travel postponed. Families adjusted constantly, often without external acknowledgement. Markets themselves were experienced as part of the day rather than events. Shops and stalls opened, goods were displayed, prices posted, and transactions completed. The act of buying and selling was quiet, almost ritualistic. It required attention, but not emotional intensity. The economy shaped daily movement, but rarely produced excitement. Booms appeared as slow expansions. Wages might rise slightly, shops might stock more goods, and communities felt a subtle sense of relief. There was no spectacle, no announcement. Instead, life felt easier, less constrained. People described it in practical terms. There was more bread, fuel was slightly cheaper, a few coins could be saved. Optimism was restrained. Even in prosperity, expectations remained measured. Depressions arrived with similar subtlety, though the effect was more noticeable. Prices might rise while wages remained stagnant. Credit became scarce. Shops carried less stock. Work opportunities contracted. Individuals did not experience collapse as a dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of inconveniences that gradually reduced freedom of choice. Anxiety increased quietly. Families adjusted behaviors, postponed plans, and reduced consumption without announcing the change to the broader world. Economic news arrived slowly. Newspapers and town criers reported commodity prices, local business developments, and government policies, but interpretation fell on individuals. People read numbers, noticed trends, and discussed implications, translating abstract information into practical adjustments. Financial literacy was experiential. Understanding arose from observation, calculation, and adaptation, rather than formal instruction. Employment shaped perception more than abstract policy. When a factory reduced shifts, a farm produced less, or a shop closed for lack of customers, the economic effect was immediate and personal. Each household measured its situation through work and resources rather than through national statistics. The economy existed not as a story of growth and recession, but as a series of local, lived experiences. The psychological impact of economic fluctuations was constant. Worry about scarcity, missed payments, and market unpredictability occupied mental space daily. Anxiety was often muted, managed privately, and expressed through practical adjustments rather than visible emotion. Families learned to treat uncertainty as normal, developing routines of caution and modest ambition. Community networks mitigated hardship. Neighbors shared food, exchanged labor, and negotiated informal credit arrangements. Support was quiet, reciprocal, and practical, rather than public or ceremonial. The economy's impact was absorbed collectively, but without spectacle. Social cohesion smoothed the emotional effects of financial instability. People measured prosperity not through abstract wealth, but through capacity. Could they eat enough, heat the home, purchase clothing, pay obligations? Economic success was functional, not aspirational. Even during booms, anxiety persisted, as families recognized that conditions could shift quickly. Expectations were calibrated to variability, not ideals. Seasonality reinforced economic perception. Harvests, weather, and climate shaped availability of goods and work. A bountiful harvest reduced prices and eased labor, but only temporarily. Seasonal patterns produced recurring cycles of concern and relief, creating a predictable rhythm that became part of domestic planning. The economy was embedded in natural rhythms as much as in markets. The emotional tone of economic life was restrained. Joy in good times and worry in lean times existed as low-intensity feelings, filtered through practical experience. High drama was rare. Anxiety did not erupt in public displays. Relief was not marked with celebration. Daily life required consistent adaptation, making extremes unusual. Children learned this emotional rhythm early. They observed the family adjusting to price changes, conserving resources, and managing credit. They internalized the idea that financial reality was steady, pervasive, and quietly demanding. They were taught practical calculation rather than fear, patience rather than hope, and observation rather than speculation. Economic change also influenced mobility. Families moved in search of employment, land, or opportunity. Such decisions were rarely spontaneous. Moves were calculated, often delayed, and weighed against accumulated resources. Migration was a slow response to economic conditions, not a dramatic attempt to escape or seize fortune. Markets, work, and financial interactions operated at a moderate pace. Goods moved gradually, information traveled slowly, and adaptation was incremental. People expected little rapid change, creating an environment where continuity dominated over excitement. The economy was a background structure, felt consistently rather than intensely. Credit, savings, and expenditure formed the central language of economic experience. Each household operated as a miniature system of negotiation. Adults monitored debts, planned purchases, and coordinated income carefully. Children observed these patterns, internalizing financial prudence as a moral and practical imperative. Even during national crises, bank failures, stock market shifts, or inflation, the domestic experience remained muted. Reports circulated slowly, affecting some households more than others. The individual perception of economic stress was localized, tied to wages, prices, and personal obligations. Large-scale trends were experienced as incremental adjustments rather than immediate upheaval. Economic anxiety shaped social behavior. People were cautious in interactions, reluctant to extend credit, hesitant to invest in new ventures. Conservatism became a social norm. Risk-taking existed, but was calculated, often mediated by observation of neighbors' experience rather than individual ambition. Over time, the accumulation of small adjustments produced broad change. Households adapted to new pricing structures, employment patterns, and resource availability. Consumption habits evolved. Budget.
Life within families unfolded slowly, quietly, and with a rhythm that was largely invisible to outsiders. The daily work of sustaining households, maintaining relationships, and caring for children and aging parents created patterns that repeated almost predictably across generations. The experience of family life was more about continuity than drama, about habit more than upheaval. Across towns, villages, and emerging cities, households resembled one another in structure, conversation, and the slow passing of time, even as individual personalities and events created minor variations. Marriage was often the central organizing principle of household life. Couples were bound not only by affection, but by practical necessity, combining resources, coordinating labor, and ensuring the survival of the family unit. Romance, where it existed, was secondary to responsibility. Daily life required cooperation, compromise, and attention to tasks that rarely appeared in public accounts. Husbands and wives negotiated responsibilities quietly, with reference to precedent or authority. Patterns repeated. A child was reminded of their responsibilities, a spouse reminded of shared duties, a parent reminded of obligations to elders. These exchanges were often brief, calm, and framed with the assumption that everyone understood their role. Families were multi-generational. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes aunts, uncles, and cousins coexisted in a single household or nearby dwellings. Responsibilities were distributed across age groups. Older members provided supervision and advice. Middle generations performed labor and managed resources. Younger ones contributed under guidance. This structure allowed practical tasks to be completed efficiently, while social and emotional bonds were reinforced through proximity and shared routines. Routines reinforced the repetition of conversation and behavior. Meals were prepared and eaten at predictable times. Chores were assigned according to age and ability. Daily labor, education, and social interaction followed habitual patterns. The consistency of routines encouraged similar forms of speech. Greetings, reminders, corrections, and advice were repeated regularly. Over time, these phrases became familiar markers of family life. Marriage itself was often influenced by generational patterns. Parents suggested or approved unions based on experience and practicality. Conversations about courtship, behavior, and compatibility echoed those they had received in their own youth. The language of guidance remained consistent. Prudence, patience, respect, and the importance of continuity were emphasized repeatedly. Lessons learned decades before were recycled, forming a continuous chain of domestic wisdom. Children internalized these repeated conversations. They learned acceptable behavior through quiet observation and repeated instruction, rather than formal discipline alone. Instructions about managing money, preparing meals, treating relatives, or maintaining property were heard over and over, often in slightly different phrasing, yet the essential meaning remained constant. These recurring lessons became embedded in daily practice, shaping identity and expectation. Aging parents were integrated into these routines. As grandparents grew older, households adjusted responsibilities. Younger adults assumed more labor, provided care, and reinforced traditions. Conversations shifted to include reminders about health, advice on memory, and reflections on prior generations. Older members retained authority through knowledge and experience, even as physical work declined. Respect and habit ensured that their voices continued to guide family behavior. Traditions were transmitted naturally. Seasonal celebrations, religious observances, and communal rituals were repeated with minimal instruction, their forms preserved through demonstration and participation. Children absorbed the rhythm and significance of these events quietly, noticing subtleties in preparation, timing, and etiquette. Repetition ensured continuity, linking household life across generations and even across regions where families migrated or dispersed. Siblings developed similar patterns. Older siblings guided younger ones, repeating parental instructions with their own variations. Stories, advice, and admonitions circulated horizontally within households as well as vertically across generations. Each member contributed to the cycle of repeated speech, reinforcing expectations and shared norms. These patterns extended to extended family networks, creating broader consistency in community life. Conversations also mediated emotional life. Expressions of concern, encouragement, or correction were typically restrained. Praise was quiet, scolding was calm. Emotional content was conveyed through repetition of familiar phrases and consistent tone, rather than dramatic expression. Children learned not only the content of guidance, but the manner of interaction, calm, measured, predictable. Even humor and storytelling followed patterns. Tales of local events, personal mistakes, or minor triumphs were repeated with slight variations, often accompanied by predictable reactions. Laughter was muted, restrained by habit and social expectation, yet it signaled shared understanding. In this way, storytelling became a means of social cohesion, preserving communal memory while reinforcing daily norms. As families expanded, patterns persisted. New members, through marriage or birth, were introduced to routines gradually. Advice was repeated patiently, tasks demonstrated multiple times, and expectations were reiterated. Household rhythm remained stable, absorbing newcomers through repetition rather than disruption. Generational continuity was preserved because habits, language, and roles were internalized through daily practice.
Even as external circumstances changed, economic shifts, technological innovations, or urbanization, familial conversations remained anchors of stability. Children and adults alike compared present conditions with remembered experience, often noting differences and commenting quietly. Yet the essential structure of interaction persisted. Guidance, correction, and instruction were conveyed gently, consistently, and repeatedly. Conversations about morality, behavior, and expectation were similarly cyclical. Parents emphasized honesty, diligence, respect, and patience. Siblings echoed these lessons. Grandparents reinforced them through anecdote. Even when phrasing changed, the core principles were constant, providing continuity of ethical and practical guidance. These exchanges created a moral framework embedded in everyday interaction rather than imposed formally. Life events, marriages, births, deaths, or illnesses were integrated into conversation patterns. Stories about managing loss, preparing for celebrations, or coping with hardship were told repeatedly, teaching practical and emotional strategies. New generations internalized the logic of household life without dramatic instruction. Knowledge was conveyed as habit, absorbed slowly through repeated discussion and observation. Families observed the passage of time through repetition. Daily routines, annual cycles, and generational milestones marked life quietly. Conversations repeated predictably around these markers. Morning greetings, mealtime reminders, bedtime instructions, seasonal preparations. Each repetition reinforced stability and social cohesion, linking personal experience to shared patterns across decades. Even when households migrated or adapted to new circumstances, repeated conversations provided continuity. Lessons about managing labor, finances, social obligations, and domestic tasks traveled with families. Familiar phrases became portable culture, allowing households to preserve identity and stability amidst change. Conversations across generations also included reflection. Older members recalled how they had been instructed, comparing past experiences to current practice. They repeated phrases they had heard in childhood, offering them as guidance to new generations. This created a sense of lineage, where each repeated conversation was a thread connecting past, present, and future. In moments of crisis, illness, financial stress, or interpersonal conflict, familial routines and repeated conversations offered structure. Guidance was predictable, instructions familiar, and expectations clear. Anxiety was mitigated not through novelty, but through stability. The repetition of words and habits reassured household members that life could continue despite disruption. Even small rituals like preparing meals or tending a garden were sites of repeated conversation. Instructions about chopping, cooking, planting, or harvesting were reiterated with patience. Children observed adults performing tasks, listened to explanations,